going to spill over into 2021, Lord willing, anyhow. But be that as it may, tonight I wanted to pick up and look at another character study of someone who is, we might say, lost in the credits. The person we're talking about tonight is a man named Ahithophel. And if you're thinking, Ahithophel, it's somebody that we don't talk about a whole lot. You may recall this if you were in my Sunday morning Bible class, because it wasn't all that long ago that we were studying from 2 Samuel, and we were talking about Ahithophel. He actually was one of David's closest friends. He was a very close counselor to David, and their relationship took a very big turn for the worse when Absalom rebelled against David. I'm going to set this up like I have done all the other ones. In fact, I almost set this one up a little bit differently as far as the arrangement of the sermon, but I like consistency, at least when I'm doing some of these series. I like the consistency of setting it up a certain way and just studying it that way. And so that's what I'm going to do with this one. I'm going to do like I've done the other ones. We've studied about Sosthenes. That was all the way back in February. We studied about the sons of Korah in January. We're going to go back to the Old Testament, having done New Testament last with this one, and talk about Ahithophel. But we want to get some background here, first of all. And that's where we pick up in 2 Samuel. Then chapter 15. I don't know if I told you the chapter number. I apologize. But chapter 15 is where we'll pick up, and most of this is covered in 15, 16, 17 of 2 Samuel. That's where we'll spend the vast majority of our time this evening. But to give you some background, and you begin in chapter 15, and you have this rebellion of Absalom against David. A lot of this is a consequence of David's sin with Bathsheba. He was forgiven. He, of course, committed adultery. Then he basically had Uriah murdered, her husband. Then he married Bathsheba, and later on they have Solomon. David wants to elevate Solomon to the throne. We're not told exactly why. It seems that he kind of favored Bathsheba. This was her son, Solomon. And so Solomon was in line for the throne ahead of older brothers, such as Absalom. But one of the consequences of David's sin, even though it was forgiven, one of the consequences was the sword shall never depart from your house. And so part of this is, part of that is what you're seeing here in chapter 15. So Absalom, he prepares chariots and horses and 50 men to run before him, and he goes and he stands beside the gate. He's been restored now back to, he was originally kind of in exile. He's been brought back, and so he's standing in the gate. And anybody that would come and have a controversy, verse 2 says that, they would come to the king for judgment, and Absalom would ask him, what city are you from? And they would tell him whether, and he would say, well, your matters are good, verse 3, and right, but there's no man deputed of the king to hear thee. And he would say, oh, that I were made judge in the land, that every man which hath any suit or cause might come unto me, and I would do him justice. So he would put forth his hand, and Absalom would take their hands and kiss them. We'd sometimes joke about, somebody running for political office or a politician kissing the babies and things like that. That's what Absalom's doing. He's really going after the people and stealing the hearts. In fact, that's what verse 6 tells us. On this manner did Absalom to all Israel that came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. And what happens is Absalom tells David, I need to go pay a vow. So he says he's going to go pay a vow. This is just a smoke screen so he can carry out his plan. And so the king says, David, of course, says, go in peace, verse 9. He arose and went to Hebron, but Absalom sent spies, verse 10 tells us, throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, as soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, you shall say, Absalom reigneth in Hebron. With Absalom went 200 men out of Jerusalem that were called, and they went in their simplicity and knew not anything. So here's some men, at least, that they didn't know. They're not in on the conspiracy. They're going with Absalom. They don't know what's going on. It seems that he wants this for an appearance of having a big, massive following. But Absalom sent for Ahithophel, the Dollahite, David's counselor, from his city, even from Gilo, while he offered sacrifices, and the conspiracy was strong, for the people increased continually with Absalom. So Absalom rebels against David. Now, when you look at the next few verses, what you're going to see is David is going to flee Jerusalem. 2 Samuel 15, just picking up where we left off there in verse 13, there came a messenger to David saying, the hearts of the men of Israel are after Absalom. David said unto all his servants, that were with him at Jerusalem, "Arise and let us flee, for we shall not else escape from Absalom. Make speed to depart, lest he overtake us suddenly and bring evil upon us and smite the city with the edge of the sword." And the king's servant said unto the king, "Behold, thy servants are ready to do whatsoever my lord the king shall appoint." The king went forth and his household after him. He left 10 women which were concubines to keep the house. And the king went forth and all the people after him and tarried in a place that was far off. It goes on and gives more details about David leaving Jerusalem, but we'll stop there for purposes of time and just to be a little bit more concise here. But David decides to leave Jerusalem. We talked about this in our Bible class. I don't know, some people debate, did he leave because he was afraid that Absalom was going to come and they would be killed? I don't know. Sometimes I kind of go back and forth on this myself. I'm not so sure that he left out of fear as much as to avoid what we might call collateral damage. Absalom's going to come in and he'll wreck the city trying to get to David. And whether it might have been a combination of things, who knows? It's interesting. Sometimes you read commentators, and one commentator says David was afraid for his life. Another commentator says that's ridiculous. He wasn't afraid for his life. He's just worried about collateral damage. I don't know why it couldn't be a little bit of both. Maybe he is afraid that, hey, Absalom is going to get such a following that we're going to be in trouble. But either way, if we fight in the city, there are going to be innocent people that are going to be hurt and probably even killed. So David leaves. And while fleeing, if you drop down to verse 31, he finds out something. And one told David, saying, "Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom." And David said, "O Lord, I pray thee, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness." So while he's fleeing, he finds out his counselor, David's counselor, Ahithophel, has joined in this conspiracy. Now, you and I, as the reader, we were told earlier, there in verse 12 of the same chapter. Again, Ahithophel was his counselor, David's counselor. 1 Chronicles 27:33, Ahithophel was the king's counselor, and Hushai the Archite was the king's companion. He was also his friend. We find out later in Psalm 41, verse 9, which is a psalm that was written when David was fleeing from Absalom. And he makes the statement, "Yea, mine own familiar friend, in whom I trusted, which did eat of my bread, had lifted up his heel against me." Now that's a statement that'll later find a prophetic fulfillment in Jesus being betrayed by a friend. So there's some typology here as well. But Ahithophel was David's counselor, and he was also his friend. And so what David does at this point is, you pick up in verse 32, when David was come to the top of the mount where he worshiped God, behold, Hushai the Archite came to meet him with his coat rent and earth upon his head, sign of grief, distress. Unto whom David said, "If thou passest on with me, then thou shalt be a burden unto me. But if thou return to the city and say unto Absalom, I will be thy servant, O king, as I have been thy father's servant hitherto, so will I now also be thy servant. Then mayest thou for me defeat the counsel of Ahithophel." And he goes on and he says, "Do you not have here with you Zadok and Abiathar?" Verse 35, the priests. "Well, whatever you hear, tell it to them," he says there in verse 35. "And they had their 2 sons, Ahimaaz and Jonathan. And by them ye shall send unto me everything that ye can hear." Last part of verse 36. So Hushai, David's friend, came into the city, and Absalom came into Jerusalem. So in the hopes of defeating Ahithophel's counsel, David sends Hushai back, and he says, maybe you can counsel against him and do some good, and whatever you can find out, any intelligence, any information, send it back. Send word to me, and maybe that'll help us to preserve the kingdom and keep Absalom from getting the kingdom. Now again, we know David, not a perfect man, but we know his character. David is not worried about his own personal ambition, but he knows Absalom is not a godly man. Absalom is not going to be a godly ruler. He is not the man for the job as far as the king, and he's going to hurt the kingdom. So David, he wants, this is not just, well, I want to hold on to my position. This is not just, I want to get revenge. He's saying, this is not the best thing. So he sends Hushai back in the hopes of doing that. And of course, in verse 31, we already noticed where David made the statement there at the end of that verse O Lord, I pray thee, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. Now, some things I want to notice about Ahithophel, and this is where I mentioned I thought about arranging this a little bit differently, but I decided just to put this kind of in the background section. We'll pick up in chapter 16, and notice some things about Ahithophel. We notice about Ahithophel his greatness. This man, in fact, look at chapter 16, verse 23. The counsel of Ahithophel, which he counseled in those days, was as if a man had inquired at the oracle of God. So was all the counsel of Ahithophel, both with David and with Absalom. He had a unique wisdom, a unique ability to give good counsel, good advice. And it was just like you ask of an angel of God, or as it says here, oracle of God. His advice was solid. Not only that, if you go back to chapter 15, we read it in verse 12, latter part of the chapter, the conspiracy was strong. He sends for Ahithophel, Absalom does, and the conspiracy was strong, for the people increased continually with Absalom. The implication here is the people are increasing with Absalom because of Ahithophel. He's joined the conspiracy, and he's actually helping the cause because he's shrewd, and he's got some wisdom. So he's telling Absalom, he's guiding him step by step. And when Absalom's listening, things are going well. I looked in the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia. Sometimes people just refer to it as the ISBE. But it says this is in part, it's not the whole article, but just something to give you an idea. Ahithophel has a reputation for marvelous, practical sagacity or wisdom. He did not show this in joining the conspiracy, but it is in evidence in his management of the affair. According to the record of the hearts of the people, in spite of the much fault they had to find, were all the time with David. Absalom's only chance of success was by the method of surprise and stampede. There must be a crisis in which everybody would join Absalom because everybody thought that everybody else had done so. Such a state of public sentiment could last only a very few days, but if in those few days David could be put out of the way, Absalom might hold the throne in virtue of his personal popularity and in default of a rival, David. The first part of the program was carried out with wonderful success. In fact, I'll hold off. We'll get to that in just a moment. The first part was carried out with wonderful success. When it came to the second part, Ahithophel's practical wisdom was blocked by Hushai's adroit appeal to Absalom's personal vanity. Ahithophel saw with absolute clearness that Absalom had sacrificed his one opportunity, and he committed suicide to avoid participation in the shameful defeat which he saw could not be averted. I think that's a pretty succinct summary of what happened here. His advice was great in those days. Ahithophel was, and that's why we say this is his one part of his background, his greatness. When he gave advice, you wanted to listen. But we also see within this passage his grudge. I want to explain this, and I don't know that we can be for certain on this, and this is another one I'm kind of back and forth on, but I want you to notice something in 2 Samuel. Hold your spot and go to chapter 23, verse 34. You have a list here. It's talking about David's mighty men. But in verse 34, you have in this list of the mighty men, 2 Samuel 23, 34, Eliphalet, the son of Ahasbai, the son of the Maachathite, and then he mentions Eliam. Eliam, the son of Ahithophel, the Gilonite. You say, okay, well, what does that mean? Well, we need to go backwards a little bit now from where we started off and go back to chapter 12 of 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel 12, it's chapter 11. 12 is where Nathan comes to rebuke David. Chapter 11, verses 2 and 3. It came to pass in an eventide that David arose from off his bed and walked upon the roof of the king's house, and from the roof he saw a woman washing herself, and the woman was very beautiful to look upon. And David sent and inquired after the woman, and one said, Is not this Bathsheba the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? He says somebody says, hey, I believe that's Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and she's the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Well, again, Eliam was the son of Ahithophel. Again, going back to the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia, that fellow makes a case there. There are various contributors. I don't remember which one of the contributors this was, but he makes the case that he believes it makes more sense that this is just coincidental and there happen to be two men by that name. He doesn't think this Ahithophel that betrayed David would have been old enough at this time for that to be his granddaughter, Bathsheba, that is. Other folks say, no, it does seem to be pretty clear that this is the case. It could be, and so I went ahead and I wanted to mention this because if indeed Bathsheba was the granddaughter of Ahithophel, then wow, you begin to understand some of why he would just turn his back on someone who had been so close to and such tight friendship with. Again, I don't know. I can't say 100% for sure, but if so, he may very well have been holding a grudge and holding it for some time. And who knows, he may have even been just waiting and biding his time and just waiting for the right opportunity to carry out this grudge that he'd been holding for so long. If indeed that is the case, it really is pitiable. It's sad that he waited that long and how it ultimately came back to bite him, if you know the end of this story, and we'll get to that in a moment if you don't. So his grudge, again, I can't say that with 100% certainty. I can't say one way or the other. I think there could be a case made either way. But I did want to mention that in case that is, then you see very well probably would, if that's the case, Bathsheba was his granddaughter, then I think you see him carrying out this grudge that has held against David. But let's go on and talk about his greed and his guile. I kind of combine these because they're right all together here in these same few verses. Getting back to 1 Samuel 16, beginning there in verse 20. 1 Samuel 16, beginning at verse 20, you see, and again, this is where the ISBE guy says, I think he thinks it makes more sense that what's guiding Ahithophel is not a grudge, because he doesn't think it fits for him to be the grandfather of Bathsheba. He thinks it's more along the lines of just personal ambition. And if so, then that would be the greed. I think there's ambition here either way. I don't think there's any question. He's got some greedy, selfish ambition, and the guile is just the deceit, the treachery, the betrayal, the treason. And you see that here. And so you see it carried out in these few verses here. Then said Absalom to Ahithophel, Give counsel among you what we shall do. So he says to Ahithophel, knowing that Ahithophel gives great advice, he says, What do you think we should do? Ahithophel says, I tell you what to do. Go in unto thy father's concubines, which he hath left to keep the house, and all Israel shall hear that thou art abhorred of thy father. Then shall the hands of all that are with thee be strong. Well, Absalom, what if some folks are kind of on the fence here? And they think, well, what if David feels sorry for Absalom and just, or what if Absalom, it's my dad, I can't fight against my father, and they're going to make up, and everything's going to be a happy family again, and here we are, we're just going to be counted as traitors, treasonous. He says, I'm telling you what, you go violate the concubines in the sight of all Israel, and everybody will know you have passed the point of no return. You will have crossed the Rubicon at that point. So they spread Absalom a tent, verse 22 says, on top of the house, and he did that indeed. The counsel of Ahithophel, of course, which he counseled in those days, was as if a man had inquired at the oracle of God. In other words, this worked. The people were strengthened to follow Absalom. They know there's no turning back now. There's only one way this plays out. We're either going to defeat David and we're going to be on the winning side, or we're going to lose, but there's not going to be any, we're family, let's just call this thing off. He's made himself abhorred in the sight of his father now. Moreover, verse 1 of chapter 17 says, he didn't stop there. You see his greed and his ambition here. Ahithophel says, let me now choose out 12,000 men. I will arise and pursue after David this night, and I will come upon him while he is weary and weak-handed, and will make him afraid, and all the people that are with him shall flee, and I will smite the king only, and I will bring back all the people unto thee. The man whom thou seekest is as if all returned, so all the people shall be in peace. And the saying pleased Absalom well, and all the elders of Israel. Ahithophel says, that's part one. You violate the concubines. And that was what the ISBE author was talking about when he says phase one was carried out with perfection, basically, following Ahithophel's advice. Part two of Ahithophel's advice was, you let me take 12,000 men. He's weary. He's been on the run. He's fleeing. And I'm going to go and I'm going to attack. And I'm going to take him right there, and I'll kill just the king. We don't have to have it doesn't have to be a big battle or anything like that. We're going to get just the king. And once he's gone and out of the way, you can take the throne by default. And you know what's amazing is getting back to the greatness of Ahithophel. That was good advice. And every indication is if he had listened to that, it would have worked. Do you remember David's prayer was to defeat the counsel of Ahithophel? And so that brings us to the next part here, talking about the background, and that is Ahithophel's gloom and ultimately his grave. When you pick up at verse 5 of chapter 17, Absalom says, well, let's hear what Hushai has to say. He went back, like David said, going to try to work against the counsel of Ahithophel. And so Absalom says, well, let's just to cover all the bases, let's hear what Hushai has to say. And Hushai says, well, Absalom says to him, Ahithophel has spoken after this manner. Shall we do after his saying? If not, speak thou. So Hushai says, the counsel that Ahithophel hath given is not good at this time. Those are bold words to say, just knowing how respected his counsel was. But he says, that's not the best advice right now. And Hushai is pretty smart too. He's going to appeal to the vanity of Absalom. And if there's one thing we've learned about Absalom, he's got that ego. So he says, look, you know your father and his men. They're mighty men, verse 8. And they're chafed in their minds. They're frustrated. They're upset. They've had to run. And now they're just, almost like he's saying, they're looking for a fight. Like a bear robbed of her whelps in the field, and thy father is a man of war, and will not lodge with the people. If Ahithophel takes his men to go out there and try to just assassinate him, that's not going to work. He's not going to be lodging with the people. He's hid now in some pit, verse 9, or in some other place. It'll come to pass with some that be overthrown at the first, that whosoever heareth it will say, there is a slaughter among the people that follow Absalom. There's that appeal to Absalom's ego. Look, few of your men get killed. Next thing you know, word gets around that all of your soldiers are just getting slaughtered. It's going to look bad on you, Absalom. And he also that is valiant, whose heart is as the heart of a lion, shall utterly melt. For all Israel knoweth that thy father is a mighty man, and they which be with him are valiant men. People are going to believe it, Absalom, when they hear it, because everybody knows David is not to be messed with. Therefore I counsel that all Israel be generally gathered together unto thee, from Dan even to Beersheba, as the sand that is by the sea for multitude, and that thou go to battle in thine own person. You need to muster the troops, and you need to be at the head of the troops and lead the charge. Because, you're going to glory, Absalom. You see how he appeals to his ego? So shall we come upon him in some place where he shall be found, and we will light upon him as the dew falleth on the ground. And of him and all the men that are with him there shall not be left so much as one. Ahithophel says, just let me go take out the king. Hushai says, no, you need to get troops, and you need to go and take them all out. And it'll be glorious for you, Absalom. Moreover, if he be gotten into a city, then shall all Israel bring ropes to that city. We'll draw it into the river until there be not one small stone found there. And Absalom and all the men of Israel said, the counsel of Hushai the Archite is better than the counsel of Ahithophel. Watch it. For the Lord had appointed to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel, to the intent that the Lord might bring evil or calamity upon Absalom. When you drop down to verse 23, here you see that while we say his grave, when Ahithophel saw that his counsel was not followed, he saddled his donkey and arose and gat him home to his house, to his city, put his household in order, and hanged himself, and died, and was buried in the sepulchre of his father. What an ignominious end for this man who was so great, who was so wise, gave such good counsel. But he's upset. Oh, you're not going to listen to me? I'm just going to go home and kill myself. And literally, that is what he did. Absalom followed Hushai's advice. They gathered troops. They went to battle. And if you read on in the text, you find out Absalom goes to battle. And this is where, it's one of those accounts we've studied many times, even from childhood. Absalom is riding along, and he gets caught, suspended between the sky and the earth, caught in the bough of a tree by his hair. And Joab later comes along and kills him, and that ends the rebellion. And so there's your background. I want to look at just a few lessons. I have 4 of these, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly. Yes, 5 of these that we want to look at. 5 lessons that we can learn from Absalom and that we need to learn from Absalom. Number 1 is beware of bitterness. Again, I want to remind you, I'm not saying with certainty that Bathsheba was his granddaughter, but if so, and this was a grudge that he's carrying out and holding on to for years, then you see the danger of bitterness. One fellow put it, I'm paraphrasing, but he said, bitterness is like a boomerang that often comes back on us, and as he put it, it'll cut your heart out sometimes. It often comes back on us and wounds us worse than the person at whom we are casting that bitterness. Hebrews 12:15 tells us this, looking diligently, lest any man fail of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up trouble you, and thereby many be defiled. Beware of bitterness. It will consume you, and it will kill you. There have been studies that show it can hurt you, it can kill you physically, but it will surely kill you spiritually if you hang on to that. You cannot go to heaven with a bitter, grudgeful, vengeful spirit or attitude. Learn the lesson and beware of bitterness. Number 2, beware of sinful greed or ambition. We talked about that with Ahithophel. Whether he was Bathsheba's grandfather or not, there definitely was some ambition there. He wants to take advantage of a situation and turn it to his own good. I think about 2 Kings chapter 11, verse 1. We learn there that Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, she saw that her son was killed. I just went blank. Jehu. I couldn't think of the fellow's name. Jehu goes and he's on this mission, and part of that he kills Ahaziah. Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, she sees that. He was the king of Judah, by the way. She sees that, and you know what she does? She's an opportunist. She's got that sinful greed and ambition. She goes, the text says she arose and destroyed all the seed royal. She goes and says, well, here's my chance. And she kills the children of the king. Unthinkable. That's where ambition, sinful ambition, will take you. And thankfully, Jehoash was hidden from her. And later on, he'll be made the king. She thought she got all the royal descendants, but she didn't. But that sinful greed, that ambition, Paul talks about he talks about them a lot in Galatians. He talks about them a lot in other books of the New Testament, but he's talking about Judaizers. And what he's talking about so often, he doesn't come out necessarily and say it in these exact words, but what he's basically saying of them is they were in many ways opportunists, and they had this ambition. They wanted to be somebody, and the gospel was kind of encroaching upon their religious territory, and they didn't like that. They didn't like losing their standing. They didn't like losing their position. Instead of doing what they should have done and getting right with God, they oftentimes would try to look for opportunities to advance themselves. And one of the occasions where Paul is kind of talking about this is in Galatians 4:16 and 17. And he tells the Galatians, am I therefore become your enemy because I tell you the truth? In other words, he's saying they're not telling you the truth. But he says they, talking about those Judaizers, they zealously affect you, but not well. Yea, they would exclude you that ye might affect them. They're ambitious, they're opportunists, and they're trying to take advantage of you, he says, to promote their own interests. We need to learn from Ahithophel that selfishness, that selfish ambition, that sinful ambition, it's not going to get you anywhere. At least not anywhere good in the long run. Number 3, we need to learn don't think too highly of men. Beware of thinking too highly of men. Ahithophel's advice was good. We noticed that in 1 Samuel 16:23. It's just like asking an oracle of God. But he wasn't on God's side. In chapter 17, verse 14, we're told this was of the Lord to defeat Ahithophel's counsel. He's not following God. And of course, David had prayed that God would turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. And God is listening, not because God's partial to David. We talked this morning, God's not partial. Not that God's partial to David, it's that Ahithophel was not on God's side. How many people suffered because they trusted too much in Ahithophel? We know Absalom did, right? David suffered. He mentions it was his friend. Psalm 55 is another similar passage. He says, it was not an enemy that reproached me. Then I could have borne it. Neither was it he that hated me that did magnify himself against me. Then I would have hid myself from him. But it was thou, a man mine equal, my guide and mine acquaintance. We took sweet counsel together and walked into the house of God in company. He said, this was my friend, and he betrayed me. David was harmed because of the actions of Ahithophel. Absalom, David, I don't know that you'd say he necessarily put too much trust in him, but he was certainly harmed as a consequence of Ahithophel's actions. Absalom put too much trust in Ahithophel, and because of his trust in him and using him for his own selfish purposes, he suffered ultimately because of it. And that's really another lesson that I'm going to say for another one of I've got another Lost in the Credit from the Old Testament I'm planning on in a few months. But there's another lesson here you could look at from Absalom's standpoint. You better be careful, beware of yes men, because that's what Ahithophel was for Absalom in a sense. But there were others as well who suffered. Think about passages such as 2 Timothy 4, 1 through 4, where Paul says, I charge thee therefore before God and the Lord Jesus Christ, who shall judge the quick, the living, and the dead at his appearing in his kingdom. Preach the word. Be instant in season, out of season. Reprove, rebuke, exhort with all longsuffering. For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine. But after their own lust shall they heap to themselves teachers, having itching ears. And they shall turn away their ears from the truth and shall be turned unto fables. You can always find somebody to tell you what you want to hear, if that's what you're looking for. Or are you looking to hear God's word? Are you looking to hear the truth? You got to beware of thinking too highly of man. 1 John 4:1, John says, by inspiration, beloved, believe not every spirit, but try the spirits. Test the spirits, whether they are of God, because many false prophets are gone out into the world. I love Proverbs 25:19. I think it certainly applies here in the case of Absalom and Ahithophel. Confidence in an unfaithful man in time of trouble is like a broken tooth and a foot out of joint. Don't put confidence in an unfaithful man. Put your confidence in someone who is faithful, but ultimately put your confidence in Almighty God. It's not wrong to esteem men for their work's sake in the Lord, but we want to make sure our confidence ultimately is in God. In 1 Corinthians 3:21, Paul says, therefore let no man glory in men. And then in 4:6, he says, and these things, brethren, have I in a figure transferred to myself and to Apollos for your sakes, that you might learn in us not to think of men above that which is written. You see, the Corinthians had a problem. Some of them said, I'm of Paul. Some of them said, I am of Cephas or Peter. He says, you're carnal. You are thinking too highly of men. You need to be following the Lord. not some human being. So he tells them over and over again in that book, don't be thinking too highly of men. That's a lesson we learn from 1 Corinthians in several places. It's also a lesson we learn from Ahithophel. Number 4, beware of pride. It seems Ahithophel became afflicted with an eye disease. Not an EYE eye disease, but a problem with his pride. He thought he was really somebody. Now, he was great. His counsel was good counsel, but he got carried away with pride. Maybe it was because of his position. Maybe it's because so many people trusted in his wisdom that he got caught up in pride. And you know the verse, Proverbs 16:18, pride goeth before destruction, and an haughty spirit before a fall. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he shall lift you up, James 4:10 tells us. Beware of pride. How many people are going to be lost in the day of judgment because of sinful pride? How sad. And then one final lesson here we learn from Ahithophel, and that is beware of despair. What do we mean by that? I want you to compare how Ahithophel handles his disappointment to how David handles his. They're both disappointed in this account, right? I mean, David is really disappointed. His own son has betrayed him. His counselor and close friend has betrayed him. And what does David do? Well, I'm just going to go home and end it all. What you find is in Psalm 55, and I realize there's some question as to whether or not that was written at this exact time, but a lot of scholars believe it was. Psalm 55, you have David crying out to the Lord for help in this situation. Psalm 41 that we've already mentioned during this time period. David takes it to God. And what does Ahithophel do? He goes and ends his life. I want you to think about a New Testament example. You compare how Ahithophel handles his disappointment to how Paul handled his. Paul is on the road to Damascus. Acts 26, 9 through 19, he's given an account of his conversion, a recount of his conversion to Agrippa. And he says, I'm going to Damascus. I've got letters. I'm going to arrest people and kill them if I can. Because I'm doing the Lord's work. And I'm putting an end to those people that they follow the way. That was what they often called him, the way, because Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, John 14:6. And he says, all of a sudden, I see a light. I hear a voice, and he says, I'm Jesus whom you persecute. You're persecuting me. And Paul doesn't say, well, look at this, man. What a disappointment. I just might as well go home and end it all. He says in verse 19, whereupon, O King Agrippa, I was not disobedient unto the heavenly vision. And in Acts 22, when he recounts it there, you have a man named Ananias who comes to him, sent by the Lord, and he says, why are you waiting? Arise and be baptized and wash away thy sins, calling on the name of the Lord. You have another account in chapter 15 of the book of Acts, 36 through 40. John Mark had departed the mission trip previously, and so Paul decides we're going to go back around to these churches and check on them and see how they're doing, and Barnabas says, okay, well, we're going to take John Mark with us. Paul says, oh, no, we're not. And Barnabas says, I am. I'm taking him with me. And so they have this sharp disagreement. Paul doesn't get so disappointed that he starts trying to split the church or attack Barnabas or attack John Mark or to go and do something especially as drastic as Ahithophel did. He says, well, we're not going to agree on this, so you go and you take John Mark, Barnabas, and I'll go and I'm going to take Silas. And as we've pointed out before, one mission team becomes two, and they doubled up the work for the Lord. What a difference in how to handle disappointment. Sometimes we have a situation where things don't go our way. How do we handle that? Do we get mad and pick up our toys and go home, as we sometimes say? Do we, God forbid, go to such an extreme as Ahithophel? Or do we say, you know what do I need to do with this situation? How can I best use this situation to the glory of God? You may find out you're not right. I mean, tonight, you might even find out, you might be sitting here tonight, and I always say it's not complicated. We know when 99% of the folks know when they're not right with God. You may be sitting here and realizing, I'm not right with God. I need to get right with God. What do you do about that? Do you just wallow in self-pity, and do you wallow in despair? Or do you say, you know what? Jesus came and shed his blood so that I can get right with God. Maybe as a child of God, you're not where you need to be. What do? Do you just get down in the depths of despair? Or do you say, thank God for the blood, and I can get right with God? Beware of despair. How differently those two men handled their disappointments. Don't let disappointments defeat you. Jesus came so that we can have a second chance, and sometimes a third chance, a fourth chance. If I'm alive and mentally able to repent and turn back to God and obey him, and I'm willing to do that, he'll forgive. So as we close out tonight, there's so many things we can learn from Ahithophel. He's one of those, there are so many lessons from Ahithophel you don't want to emulate, so many characteristics you don't want to emulate. But I can't think of one more appropriate to end on than how do we deal with disappointment when there's sin in our lives, when there's something that needs to be made right. How do we deal with that? Ahithophel could have turned back and done what was right, just like Judas. Could have turned back and done what was right, but he goes to that extreme. What do we do with our disappointments? Maybe you need to respond to heaven's invitation to obey the gospel. Maybe you need to get your life right with God. Maybe you need prayers for strength. If we can help you in any way in going to heaven, we stand ready, willing, and able to do that as we stand and sing to encourage you.